the world is thinking about sanctions, additional sanctions, wider sanctions, deeper sanctions, special sanctions, very special sanctions, and so that has not changed Mr. Putin's behavior over time. Yes, it has affected Russia. Yes, it has affected the Russian people and the Russian economy. But what has not happened is changing Mr. Putin's behavior, because here we are.
Now, the president of Ukraine insists his forces remain in control of the capital, Kyiv, and other major cities. Volodymyr Zelensky says troops have derailed a Russian plan to capture him overnight. UK intelligence says Russian forces are around 19 miles from the centre of the capital on the third day of their invasion. There's been gunfire and street fighting in the capital overnight, and a block of flats has been hit by a missile. In the eastern city of Kharkiv, Ukraine's second city, officials say troops have fought off a Russian attack, and they've issued a shelling alert warning citizens not to move around the city. There have also been clashes near the southern city of Odessa. Meanwhile, Russia says it has captured the southeastern city of Melitopol, but that claim has not been verified just yet. Now, I'm delighted now to be able to speak to General Philip Breedlove, a retired four-star Air Force general who was the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO during the 2014 Russian aggression in Crimea. General, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Alexis.
General, first question, would this be happening today had we dealt with the Russian aggression in Crimea differently in 2014?
I don't think so. In fact, I would take you further back in history. If we'd have dealt with the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008 better, we wouldn't have arrived at 2014. If we had dealt better with 2014, we wouldn't find ourselves here today. And if we don't get this right now, we'll be right back here again in 2 or 3 years.
What does getting it right look like, General?
We have to change Mr. Putin's behavior. Currently, the world is thinking about sanctions, additional sanctions, wider sanctions, deeper sanctions, special sanctions, very special sanctions, and so that has not changed Mr. Putin's behavior over time. Yes, it has affected Russia. Yes, it has affected the Russian people and the Russian economy. But what has not happened is changing Mr. Putin's behavior, because here we are.
And how do we change his behaviour, General, particularly with the current circumstances where it's been made abundantly clear by President Biden, Prime Minister Johnson, and all the other leaders of Western countries supporting Ukraine that they will support, but they will not engage in combat?
So this is a very tough question. I sort of speak of the nation's power simply in diplomatic power, informational intelligence power, military power, and economic power. We have dealt with Russia only in economic terms, truly, across the last decade plus. And that's not working. It's clear it's not working. And so we now have to look to the other forms of national power, diplomatic, informational, military, and adjust our approach in ways that makes it changes Mr. Putin's calculus.
Do you think it would ever be sensible to engage with Russia militarily?
Well, clearly, if he goes across a NATO line, our governments, the Western governments, have said that's it. And we will be there for Article 5. And you see forces moving around. You see the NRF being called up for the first time in the history of NATO. You see SACEUR being given new powers to adjust his forces and alert his forces. So these are all good turns for helping to defend NATO should he come across. But those are not addressing what's going on in Ukraine right now. And I think our focus is not only about the long term, but we have to think about how we stop this senseless slaughter of a country. The Ukrainians are fighting for freedom, and really the West is watching.
What is your assessment of the military side of the conflict so far? We've been told that the Russians have moved into about 50 kilometers, 19 miles outside of Kyiv, and various other cities. Predominantly, we're seeing the Ukrainian army doing their best to stop tanks moving along the major arteries. We were also hearing of civilians just being handed out Kalashnikovs and being told to make Molotov bombs. How long do you think Ukraine can resist the incoming Russian forces?
Well, let's back up and answer a couple other basic questions right up front. First of all, the news you hear in the confusion at the beginning of a conflict is rarely correct. And so we need to filter a little bit what we're hearing. We really don't have great reporting out where the actual tough fighting is going on. Most of the international reporters are camped in cities and waiting for something to happen around them. So what the world knows about the fight is really fairly limited. Some, including I, are talking to friends on the ground there and get more data. But even that has to be filtered because it's fog and confusion, is what we talk about in war. Secondarily, it's clear that Mr. Putin expected to have faster and better results. The Ukrainians are fighting, and I think they're going to stay and fight. I think Mr. Zelensky is setting a great example for his nation in his defiance and staying in the capital and speaking to his people. And so I don't think Mr. Putin expected such tough pushback. And God bless the men and women of Ukraine who are fighting. Third, the longer this or the slower this goes for Russia, the tougher it is for them. Excuse me. As their logistics lines begin to thin and grow longer, they are more exposed to this territorial fighting force that Ukraine has set up. And hitting those supply lines will cause many problems for Russia. The old axiom of pretenders talk about fighting, real soldiers talk about logistics comes into play in a big fight like this. And that's going to become a bigger and bigger problem for Russia. And frankly, the longer that the exterior world sees this senseless war, this absolutely crazy war that is built by Mr. Putin. This is a completely contrived crisis by Mr. Putin. The longer that he is held accountable for that, and the more that he is his false narrative is exposed, the harder it's going to be for him to continue.
General, one last very quick question. I just wanted to get your thoughts on US Senator Marco Rubio. He tweeted today, and this is his words: "I wish I could share more, but for now I can say it's pretty obvious that many that something is off with Putin. He has always been a killer, but his problem now is different and significant. It would be a mistake to assume this Putin would react the same way he would 5 years ago." Of course, Mr. Rubio is a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, which makes him privy to briefings from the American intelligence agencies. Should we be worried even more than we would have done 5 years ago about what President Putin is capable of if he's cornered?
Well, I don't like to dabble in conspiracy theory. I want to respect what Senator Rubio knows because he's exposed to things that I'm not exposed to, and frankly, uh, this whole business by Mr. Putin is a bit off. This is the most contrived. I mean, this whole neo-Nazi and drug addicts things. This is the most absurd story. I mean, Lavrov has told a lot of lies in his life, but this is the most absurd set of lies we've ever seen, and it doesn't play except for to the one or two people who want it to play. So this whole thing is a little off. And yes, we see him acting in public differently than he's acted in the past. Why that's happening, I don't know. I really don't want to join that conversation, but let's just restate it one more time. This was irrational from the beginning, and it only gets more irrational as we watch the way Putin is conducting himself. And so that is very worrisome.
So would you say, with your military experience, looking at the field as it is now, that can you see a plan emerging from Putin's side? I mean, does he want to occupy the country? With what you're seeing, what do you think he's trying to get to?
Well, first we have to remember that this is certainly about Ukraine. This is certainly about the Russia, this vision, this diatribe of Mr. Putin's about how this is Russia and these are Russians, etc. So it is about Ukraine, but also we have to remember that this is bigger than Ukraine. If you look at the two sort of documents that Russia forwarded for the West to sign, or else they would, quote unquote, use other measures, which we absolutely understand what that meant now. These two documents are really about resetting the entire security architecture of Eastern Europe, resetting it back to the glory of the Warsaw Pact days and the Soviet Union days. And this is, I think, the vision that Mr. Putin has and what he wants to leave as his legacy to Russia. And so while we are amazingly concerned and want to help our brothers and sisters in Ukraine, this is just sort of the first cog in the wheel of what Mr. Putin sees for reestablishing the border nations and reestablishing the Warsaw Pact kind of security arrangement in Eastern Europe.